The boy saved an elderly man from a Pitbull attack, but no one cared the next day when a luxurious car stopped in front of his house. Everyone froze Jimmy, walked slowly through the dusty streets, his bare feet kicking up puffs of dirt with every step. The houses he passed were small, their walls worn and cracked. The paint long since peeled away by sun and rain. Kids played in the narrow alleys, their laughter echoing off the brick and concrete. But Jimmy wasn't joining them today. He had just finished helping his mom, and his mind was on what else he could do to help out at home. The neighborhood was always noisy, but Jimmy knew every sound by heart. The cars with rusted mufflers, the barking dogs, and the occasional arguments between neighbors. It was all part of his world. His routine was simple. He sold candy outside the school gates every morning before classes started. After that, he ran errands for neighbors or helped his mom with whatever needed doing. Today was no different, and he was feeling the exhaustion settle into his bones. He took a deep breath, adjusting the small bag on his shoulder. His shirt, worn at the collar, clung to his back with sweat, but he didn't let it bother him. He was used to it. Jimmy reached his house and pushed open the gate that hung on its hinge, creaking with age. His mom was inside, sitting at the kitchen table. The table was covered in bills, and her face had that familiar tired look. She tried to smile when she saw Jimmy, but it was clear she was struggling to keep her spirits up. "Hey, Jimmy, how was today?" she asked, her voice soft but with an edge of exhaustion, same as always. "Mom sold. Some candies got a little money." Jimmy replied, pulling out a few crumpled bills and placing them on the table. His mom looked at the money, her eyes lingering a moment longer than usual. She let out a sigh that was almost inaudible. "Every bit helps, right?" she said, forcing a smile. "Yeah," Jimmy said. He knew that the bills on the table were more than what they could manage. It wasn't the first time he'd seen his mom look at them like that. He was only 12, but he understood too well what those pieces of paper meant and what they couldn't do later. That evening, Jimmy sat outside on the small stoop that led to their front door. The sky was darkening, and the street lights flickered to life, casting long shadows across the uneven pavement. He watched as a couple of police officers walked by, their eyes moving suspiciously across the houses, scanning the area. Jimmy tensed up slightly, his fingers drumming against his knees. He'd never forgotten the way they took his dad. How they'd come in without warning, making accusations without proof. His mom had screamed, and he'd hidden behind the couch, too scared to move. The memory haunted him. Even now, the police walked by without stopping, and Jimmy let out of breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. He shook his head and tried to clear his thoughts. The past was heavy, but it didn't change what he had to do. Every day, "Jimmy, come inside, it's getting late," his mom called from inside the house. He stood up, brushing the dirt off his shorts, and went back in his little sister. Barely 7, was already asleep on the old couch, her small frame curled up under a thin blanket, her face peaceful. Jimmy watched her for a moment, feeling a mix of protectiveness and frustration. He wanted better for her, for his mom, but he didn't know how to make that happen. The reality of their situation always felt like a weight on his chest. He lay down on his mattress, the springs creaking underneath him. He could hear the soft murmurs of his mom still at the kitchen table, and he stared up at the ceiling. The cracks formed patterns that he traced with his eyes, trying to distract himself. But his thoughts kept circling back to the same question. How could he change things? How could he make life easier for his mom, for his sister? The next morning came too soon. Jimmy got up before dawn, slipping out quietly to do his usual round by the school. The candies were getting harder to sell lately with everyone. In the neighborhood feeling, the pinch still, he put on his best smile, greeting the kids and parents as they passed by, holding out the small plastic box filled with brightly wrapped sweets. "Hey, Jimmy, got anything good today?" a familiar voice called out. It was Sam, one of the older kids already on his way to school. "Aw, man, you know me," Jimmy said, forcing a grin. Even though his mind was on the coins he still needed to earn. As the day wore on, Jimmy went about his routine. He ran a couple of errands for the neighbors, buying groceries for Mrs. Alvarez and carrying some bags for old Mr. Santos. The sun was blazing, and by the time Jimmy started his walk home, the heat had drained most of his energy. He felt the sweat trickle down the back of his neck, his shirt sticking to his skin. He walked slowly, the weight of everything pressing down on him, until something out of the ordinary caught his attention ahead of him. A man in a wheelchair was struggling. It looked like one of his wheels was stuck, and he was having trouble moving. Jimmy squinted, recognizing the older man from a few streets over. He was about to cross the road to help when he noticed something else. Movement fast and aggressive. A dog, big and angry, came into view. Teeth bared, heading straight for the man. Jimmy's heart leapt into his throat. He paused, frozen for a split second. The street was almost empty. No one else seemed to be around. The man's shouts for help echoed in the air, desperate and panicked. Jimmy felt a surge of fear grip him, fear of the dog, fear of getting hurt. But then he looked at the old man. His face twisted in terror, unable to move without thinking any further. Jimmy dropped his bag and ran, his bare feet slapped against the pavement as he sprinted toward the scene, his pulse pounding in his ears. The dog was almost on top of the man, now its growl growing louder, the sound vicious and raw. Jimmy didn't stop to think. He reached the wheelchair, grabbing the handles and pulling with everything he had, yanking it backward, trying to get the man away from the animal. The dog snapped, its teeth clamping down inches from Jimmy's arm. He could feel the rush of air as it barked, the deep guttural sound vibrating through him. His muscles burned as he pulled again, adrenaline pushing him forward. The man in the chair was shouting something, but Jimmy couldn't focus on anything except getting them away. Finally, after what felt like forever, a car horn blared from down the street. The dog hesitated, its head jerking toward the noise. It gave Jimmy just enough time to pull the wheelchair a few more feet back away from danger. The animal, startled by the noise, eventually backed off, disappearing down an alley. Jimmy stood there, breathing hard, his hands trembling as he held on to the wheelchair. Are you okay?" He managed to ask, his voice. "Horar," the old man looked at him, his face pale. His eyes wide, he nodded, his mouth opening and closing as if he was trying to find the right words. Finally, he managed a shaky, Thank you, boy. You saved me." Jimmy swallowed, nodding. He felt the burn in his muscles, the sweat dripping into his eyes, but more than anything, he felt the strange mix of fear and relief. He looked around the street, still mostly empty, and realized no one else had come. It was just him and this stranger, both breathing heavily the danger. Finally, he stayed there until the man seemed okay enough to wheel himself away. Then Jimmy picked up his bag, his legs still shaky as he started his walk home. He didn't feel like a hero. He just felt tired. The sun was low on the horizon as Jimmy walked back home. The sky was turning a soft orange, and the shadows on the ground stretched long across the pavement. He kept his eyes ahead, still feeling the adrenaline pumping through his veins his legs, moving on autopilot. His thoughts replayed everything: how close the dog had gotten, the old man's panicked face, the snapping jaws. He could almost hear the growl still in his ears as Jimmy reached his street. The familiar sight of his house came into view. His mother was on the porch, and as soon as she saw him, her face broke into a smile. She waved, calling out, "Jimmy, you're late today. Everything all right?" Jimmy nodded, walking up to her. He hesitated, trying to figure out how to explain what had just happened. "Yeah, I had to help someone," he said, keeping his voice casual, but he couldn't help the slight tremor in his words. His mom looked at him closely, narrowing her eyes. "Help someone? What do you mean, Jimmy?" She could tell something was different. Jimmy looked down, shifting his weight from one foot to the other. There was this old man. He was in a wheelchair, and this dog tried to attack him. I pulled him away. Jimmy said, shrugging as if it were no big deal, but his mom's eyes widened and her hand flew to her mouth. "A dog, Jimmy. You could have been hurt." She grabbed his arm, her fingers gripping tight. "Why didn't anyone else help? There wasn't anyone else." Jimmy said quietly, looking at the ground. "It was just me and him." He could feel his mom's eyes on him, could hear her sharp intake of breath. "Jimmy," she started, but then she paused, her eyes softened and her grip loosened. "I'm proud of you." She whispered, her voice trembling, "But please be careful. You know how dangerous things can be around here." Jimmy nodded, and his mom pulled him into a tight hug for a moment. He let himself lean into her, the fear finally starting to melt away under her touch. She kissed the top of his head and then released him. her eyes still filled with concern. "Come inside, I made dinner," she said, her voice a little lighter now. Jimmy followed her and glancing back at the street one more time before closing the door behind him. That night, Jimmy couldn't sleep. He lay on his mattress, staring at the ceiling. Again, the springs creaking every time he shifted his body, ache from the tension of earlier, the quiet of the night, made everything sharper in his mind. The dog's growl, the man's shout, the feeling of the wheelchair's handles in his hands as he pulled with all his strength. It was like he could still feel the weight of it. He turned over, trying to push it away, but it wouldn't leave him alone. Hours later, when he finally fell asleep, his dreams were restless. He saw the street again, the dog charging at him, its teeth bared. He saw the man helpless, reaching out. He woke up with a start, his heart pounding in the darkness. Jimmy sat up, taking deep breaths to calm himself. The house was quiet. His mom and sister were still asleep, and outside he could hear a dog barking in the distance. He ran a hand over his face, trying to shake off the unease. The next morning, Jimmy dragged himself out of bed exhausted. He did his best to keep his eyes open as he got ready to head out, grabbing his candy box and slinging his bag over his shoulder. His mom was already up making coffee in the small kitchen. "You didn't sleep much, did you?" she asked, giving him a worried. "Look, I'm fine," Jimmy lied, forcing a smile. He didn't want to worry her more than she already was as he stepped outside. Jimmy noticed how empty the street seemed. He felt the sun starting to warm his skin. The light bouncing off the cracked pavement, he walked the familiar path toward the school, his feet carrying him on their own, while his mind wandered. He was tired, but something about the events of yesterday kept tugging at his thoughts. No one else had helped. No one else had even been there. It was a strange feeling, knowing that he had been the only person standing between that old man and real danger. Jimmy, a voice called out, snapping him from his thoughts. He looked up and saw Mrs. Alvarez waving at him from her small garden. She was an older woman who often asked Jimmy to help carry her groceries. He smiled and waved back, "Morning, Mrs. Alvarez." He called, giving her a nod as he passed by, "Morning. Jimmy, you take care today. All right," she said, her voice full of the kind of warmth that always seemed a little out of place in their neighborhood. Jimmy continued on, his feet brushing against the dirt. He arrived at the school, setting up near the gate, as usual. Kids were already arriving, and Jimmy went back to his routine, holding out the box, exchanging sweets for coins, smiling, as if nothing had happened. But the tiredness clung to him, and he found it hard to shake off the weight pressing on his shoulders later that afternoon. As he made his way back home, Jimmy's eyes scanned the streets, searching almost without thinking. He wasn't sure what he was looking for. The old man, the dog, anything out of place. His heart picked up when he saw someone sitting in a wheelchair further down the road. It was the old man, Mr. George, parked under the shade of a tree. He looked up as Jimmy approached, recognition sparking in his eyes. "Hey kid," George said, his voice gruff but kind. "Didn't think I'd run into you again." Jimmy stopped his hands, suddenly unsure of where to go. He shoved them into his pockets, nodding at the man. "You okay?" he asked, his voice softer. Now that the danger was over, George smiled, a small, tired smile. "I'm all right. Thanks to you." He patted his armrest, and Jimmy noticed. His hands were still trembling. Slightly, wasn't a big deal, Jimmy muttered, but George shook his head. "It was a big deal to me. Kid, not a lot of people would have done what you did. Most people would have just walked away." His eyes were serious now, and Jimmy looked away, feeling a bit uncomfortable with the praise. "Well, I'm glad you're okay," Jimmy said, starting to turn away. But George called out again. "Wait, I didn't catch your name, Jimmy," he said, glancing back. "Well, Jimmy, you've got a brave heart." Don't forget that George's voice was rough, but there was something in it that made Jimmy pause. "Thanks," Jimmy said, nodding once more before continuing on his way. He walked the rest of the way home, with George's words echoing in his mind. Braveheart, Jimmy didn't feel brave. He just felt like he did what he had to do. But still, hearing it said aloud made something shift inside him. Something small but important when he got home. His mom was in the kitchen cooking, something that smelled better than usual. She turned to him with a smile, her eyes scanning him, as if looking for signs of something new. "You look different," she said, her voice teasing but curious. Jimmy shrugged, dropping his bag by the door. "Just tired, Mom." He said, though, deep down, he knew there was something else too. He just wasn't sure what it was yet. His mom nodded, giving him a long look before turning back to the stove. "All right, but tonight you're going to rest no more late nights." "Okay," Jimmy smiled a real smile. "This time." "Okay," he said. And for once, he thought that maybe he could sleep a little easier. At least for tonight, the danger was gone and his family was safe. Jimmy's body was exhausted, but his mind felt strangely light as he started his way back to the house. The day was finally over, and all the thoughts about George and what had happened swirled in his head. It was almost like a dream, a mixture of panic, courage, and everything in between. He pushed the door open gently and stepped inside. His mother was in the living room reading through some old papers. She glanced up immediately, noticing the tiredness that etched his face. Her eyes softened and she put the papers aside. "Jimmy, why don't you take a seat for a bit?" she asked, her voice. A mix of concern and affection. She could always tell when something weighed heavily on him. Jimmy dropped onto the couch next to his sleeping little sister carefully, not to wake her. He looked over to his mother, his shoulders sagging. "I ran into that old man again today," Jimmy said. After a moment, he kept his voice low, not wanting to wake his sister, the one you helped. "What did he say?" his mom asked, turning her body towards him. "He thanked me again, told me that I had a brave heart," Jimmy said, his voice trailing off. He looked down at his hands, which were resting in his lap. His mom smiled, her eyes filled with pride. "That's because you do, Jimmy," she said simply. "You did something not a lot of people would have done." Jimmy sighed. "I don't know, I was scared. The whole time I didn't feel brave." He paused, his fingers nervously fiddling with the fabric of his shorts. "Bravery isn't about not feeling scared. It's about what you do. Even when you are scared," his mother said, her voice gentle. She reached over and placed her hand on his shoulder, giving it a comforting squeeze. Jimmy didn't reply, but he nodded slightly. Her words settled into his thoughts, and he let out a slow breath. The living room was quiet. The only sound was the ticking of the old clock in the corner. His mother watched him for a moment before leaning back. "Why don't you try to get some sleep tonight, Jimmy?" she suggested, her voice still gentle. "You look like you could use it." Jimmy nodded again, and without a word, he stood up and walked towards his room. He laid down on his mattress, staring up at the ceiling. The events of the day, the old man's words, his mom's smile. It all seemed to blur together as his eyes grew heavy. The exhaustion finally caught up to him, and for the first time since it all happened, Jimmy closed his eyes and let sleep take him that night. His sleep was restless again, but not because of fear. He dreamed of the day, but this time there wasn't the sense of panic. Instead, there was the face of the old man smiling at him in gratitude. He heard George's voice telling him he had a brave heart over and over. It was strangely calming, and Jimmy didn't wake up in a cold sweat instead. When he finally opened his eyes, the morning sun was filtering through the cracks in the window. He felt rested, truly rested, for the first time in days. Jimmy sat up, rubbing his eyes and stretching his arms above his head. He could hear the sounds of his mother in the kitchen, the soft clattering of plates and cups. He stood up, yawning, and walked out into the small kitchen area. His mom was standing by the stove, stirring something in a pot. She looked over her shoulder and smiled when she saw him, morning sleepyhead. She said, her voice teasing. "Morning," Jimmy said, a small smile pulling at his lips. He felt lighter somehow. The weight that had been pressing on his chest seemed to have lifted slightly. His mother handed him a cup of tea, and he took it gratefully, wrapping his hands around the warm cup as he sipped his tea. His mother spoke up. "You know, I was thinking," she said, her tone casual, but with a hint of seriousness. "Maybe you should visit that old man again. It seems like he meant a lot to you." Jimmy looked at her surprised. "You think so?" She nodded. "You saved his life." Jimmy, I think, would mean a lot to him. "If you checked in on him," Jimmy thought about it for a moment, then nodded slowly. "Yeah, maybe you're right after breakfast." Jimmy set out again. The day was warm, and he could feel the heat of the sun on his skin as he walked. His feet moved on their own, taking the familiar path down the street towards where he'd seen George last. As he approached, he saw the old man sitting in the same spot, under the shade of the tree. George looked up when he heard Jimmy's footsteps and a smile spread across his face. "Hey, kid," he called, his voice warm. "I didn't think I'd see you again so soon." Jimmy smiled, walking over and sitting down on the curb next to him. "Yeah. Well, my mom thought I should come see how you were doing." George chuckled. "Your mom's a smart lady." He looked over at Jimmy, his eyes kind. "How are you holding up, kid?" Jimmy shrugged. "I'm okay, been thinking a lot about everything." I guess George nodded, a knowing look in his eyes. "I get that it's not easy to shake something like that." He paused, then added, "But I'm glad you're here. I've been thinking a lot about it too." "I don't know what I would have done if you hadn't come," Jimmy looked down the tips of his ears. Turning a little red, "I just did what I thought I had to do," he said quietly. George smiled again. "Well, what you did mattered. You've got a good heart, Jimmy." They sat in silence for a while, the shade of the tree keeping them cool. Despite the heat of the day, Jimmy could hear the distant sounds of children playing, the rustle of leaves as the wind blew through them. It was peaceful, and for the first time since everything had happened, Jimmy felt a sense of calm wash over him. He didn't feel like he had to do something or prove something. He was just there, and that was enough. After a while, George cleared his throat. "Listen, kid, I know things aren't easy for you." He said, his voice softer, "But if you ever need anything, you just let me know, all right? You helped me when no one else did, and that means something." Jimmy looked at him, a little surprised. He opened his mouth to say something, but George held up a hand. "No arguments, just keep it in mind." "All right," Jimmy nodded, a small smile pulling at his lips. "All right. Thanks, George." They stayed there for a while longer, talking about little things. George told stories from when he was young, and Jimmy listened, the words painting pictures in his mind. The sun moved slowly across the sky, and eventually, Jimmy knew he had to head back home. He stood up, dusting off his shorts. "I got to go," he said, giving George a nod, "but I'll see you around." "All right." George smiled, a warm and genuine smile. "I'll be here, kid. You take care of yourself." Jimmy turned and started to walk away, feeling a sense of peace he hadn't felt in a long time as he walked. He looked around the neighborhood at the houses with their worn-out walls, the kids playing in the alleys. Everything looked the same, but somehow Jimmy felt like something was different. He didn't know what it was exactly, but for the first time he felt like maybe things could get better when he got home. His mother was waiting for him, her eyes bright with curiosity. "How did it go?" she asked, her voice gentle. Jimmy smiled, setting his bag down by the door. "It was good, Mom. Real good." He didn't say much else, but he didn't need to. The look on his face told her everything she needed to know that night. Jimmy lay down on his mattress, staring up at the ceiling again. The cracks didn't seem so dark this time. His heart felt lighter, and his eyes slowly closed as sleep took over. This time, there were no restless dreams, no nightmares, just peace. The following morning felt like any other to Jimmy. He woke early, helping his mom prepare breakfast and gathering up his things. To start his day, his body felt rested, his muscles no longer aching from the fear-fueled adrenaline of the day. Before he gave his mom a small smile as he grabbed his candy box, heading for the door. "Be careful, Jimmy." She called after him, the same gentle concern in her voice. He nodded, not needing to say anything more. The sun was already rising, warming, the dusty streets casting long shadows along the narrow alleyways. He walked his usual route to the school, setting up near the front gates, exchanging candies for coins. His voice was light as he greeted the kids and their parents, and he found himself smiling more often. The feeling of calm from his visit with George seemed to stick with him, something steady to hold on to as the hours passed. The sun climbed higher in the sky, the heat pressing down, and Jimmy wiped his forehead with, at the back of his hand, looking around. The street was busier now, filled with children running by adults on their way to work. Jimmy decided to head back home, knowing his mom would need his help soon. He walked the familiar route, passing the same cracked walls, the same rusted fences. But as he neared his street, something was different. Jimmy squinted, seeing something shiny and out of place, something that didn't belong. It was a car parked right in front of his house. Not just any car, but a luxury one. The kind with smooth, polished metal that almost glowed under the sun. Jimmy's heart skipped a beat. He slowed down. Glancing around, people in the neighborhood were looking too, their eyes wide. Their whispers echoing through the air, Jimmy swallowed, his steps growing hesitant. The door of the car opened, and a man stepped out. He was well-dressed, his shirt crisp, his shoes shining. He looked out of place against the worn-out houses. The cracked sidewalks, Jimmy, the man called, looking directly at him. Jimmy's breath caught in his throat, and he hesitated before stepping closer. "Yeah, that's me," he said, his voice wary. The man smiled a genuine smile and walked over. "My name's Michael," he said, extending a hand. "I'm George's son. My father told me about you." Jimmy took the man's hand, shaking it briefly, still unsure of what was happening. "Oh, right, is George okay?" he asked, a hint of worry creeping into his voice. Michael nodded, his smile widening. "He's doing well. Thanks to you, you saved him. And I wanted to come here personally to thank you." Jimmy shifted his weight, feeling the eyes of the neighbors on him. "It was nothing," he muttered, his eyes dropping to the ground. He wasn't used to this kind of attention, and it made him uncomfortable. But Michael shook his head. "It was something. It was everything to my father and to me." He paused, glancing back at the car. "I wanted to offer you something, a way to thank you for what you did, my father." He wanted to make sure you knew how much this meant to him. Jimmy frowned, confusion etched on his face. "Offer me something." He looked at Michael, then at the car. "I don't need anything," he said, shaking his head. Michael smiled again, but there was a seriousness in his eyes. "I know you're a humble kid, Jimmy, but this isn't charity. This is gratitude. My father was very clear about this. He wants to help your family in whatever way you need." Jimmy's heart pounded in his chest. He could feel the eyes of his neighbors on him, hear their whispers getting louder. He could see his mother standing in the doorway of their house, her face a mix of confusion and concern. He turned back to Michael, shaking his head again. "I don't know," Jimmy said, his voice shaky. "I don't think I can accept something like that." Michael's expression softened. He put a hand on Jimmy's shoulder his grip, gentle. "Think about it. Okay, talk to your mother." "This isn't a handout, Jimmy. It's just a thank you." He handed Jimmy a small card, a phone number written neatly on it. "If you change your mind, call me, Jimmy." Took the card, his fingers trembling slightly as he looked down at it. Michael gave him a nod, then turned and walked back to the car. He got in the door, shutting with a soft thud, and moments later the car drove away, leaving Jimmy standing there, the card in his hand, the whispers of his neighbors all around him. He looked up, meeting his mother's eyes across the street. She looked worried, her eyes searching his, and Jimmy slowly walked over to her, his legs feeling like lead. "What was that about, Jimmy?" she asked, her voice low as she pulled him inside. She shut the door behind them, her eyes wide with concern. "It was George's son. He wants to help us too. Thank me for saving his dad," Jimmy said, his voice barely above a whisper. He handed her the card, watching as her eyes scanned the number. His mother let out a long breath, her hand trembling slightly as she handed the card back to him. "Jimmy, we don't know these people. We don't know what they want. We can't just accept things like this," she said, her voice tight. Jimmy looked down at the card, the weight of it heavy in his hand. "I know, Mom. I told him I wasn't sure, but he seemed genuine, and George. He seemed like a good man." His mom's eyes softened, and she reached out, placing a hand on his cheek. "I know you want to help, Jimmy, but we have to be careful. People don't just give things away for free. There's always a catch." Jimmy nodded, slipping the card into his pocket. "I know, Mom. I won't do anything without talking to you first," he promised. His mother smiled, but it was a sad smile, one that didn't quite reach her eyes. "All right, Jimmy, just be careful. I don't want us getting involved in something we can't handle." Jimmy nodded again, the weight of her words settling in his chest. He turned and walked to his room, sitting down on his mattress. He pulled the card from his pocket, staring at the number written on it. He didn't know what to do. Part of him wanted to believe that this was just a kind gesture, that there were no strings attached. But the other part of him, the part that had seen his father taken away, that had watched his mother struggle every single day, knew that things were never that simple. The rest of the day passed slowly. Jimmy tried to push the thoughts of Michael and the car and the card out of his head, but they kept creeping back, no matter what he did. He could hear the whispers of the neighbors through the open window, their voices carrying through the air. They were talking about him, about the car, about what it all meant. He could feel their eyes on him, even when he wasn't outside later that night as they sat down for dinner. The tension in the air was thick. His mother kept glancing at him, her eyes filled with worry, but she didn't say anything. Jimmy ate in silence, his mind still spinning after dinner. His mother finally spoke up. "Jimmy, I want you to know that I trust you." She said, her voice soft. "I know you're trying to do what's best for us, but whatever you decide, just promise me. You'll be careful. I don't want anything to happen to you." Jimmy looked at her, his chest tightening. He nodded, his voice quiet. "I promised Mom that night." As he lay on his mattress, staring up at the ceiling, Jimmy thought about everything he thought about. George, about the fear in his eyes when the dog attacked. He thought about the way George had smiled at him. The way he had said, Jimmy had a brave heart. He thought about Michael and the way he had looked at Jimmy, his eyes filled with gratitude. Jimmy reached into his pocket, pulling out the card. He stared at the number. The neat handwriting, he didn't know what he was going to do, but for now, he knew one thing he wasn't ready to. Let go of the possibility that maybe, just maybe, this was something good, something that could change things for his family. He closed his eyes, the card still clutched in his hand, and let sleep take him. The sun's sun was already high in the sky. When Jimmy woke up the next morning, he could hear his mother moving around in the kitchen, the soft clinking of dishes and the sound of water running. Jimmy sat up, rubbing his eyes. The small card still clutched in his hand. God, I wish I'd chosen somewhere else. I remember pulling into the small gravel parking area around 7:00 a.m. the morning. Air was crisp, and there wasn't another car in sight, which wasn't unusual for that time of year. I double-checked my gear. My trusty 65L backpack, loaded with basic camping supplies, a good knife, water, filtration system, emergency medical kit, and enough food for 3 days. Even though I only planned to stay for one, I'd learned early on that over-preparing is better than the alternative. The hike in was beautiful. The aspens were changing colors, and the whole forest had this golden glow. I kept track of my location using both my GPS and traditional map and compass. Another survival habit I developed, everything was going perfectly until about 2 p.m. When I reached my planned camping spot and heard something that shouldn't have been there, the distinct sound of chainsaws in the distance at first, I didn't think much of it. Maybe it was Forest Service doing some maintenance, but something felt off. This was a protected area, and I hadn't seen any notices about scheduled work. My curiosity got the better of me, and I decided to investigate. I secured my camp and marked its location on my GPS, then started moving toward the sound, staying low and quiet like I'd learned in my tracking courses. As I got closer, my heart started racing. These weren't Forest Service workers. I counted 5 men operating what looked like a makeshift logging operation. They had a small clearing where they were cutting down old growth, trees, the kind that are strictly protected in this area. Their equipment looked worn and dirty, and they had an old truck hidden under a camo tarp. These guys were definitely not supposed to be here. I should have just backed away slowly and hiked out to report them. That's what any sensible person would have done. Instead, I made the stupid decision to try and document what they were doing. Jimmy finished his breakfast, the conversation still heavy in the air. He slipped out of the house needing some fresh air, needing to clear his head. He walked the streets, the sun beating down on him, his bare feet kicking up small puffs of dust with each step. He knew the decision he had to make, but the whispers of the neighbors, the weight of his mom's words, all pressed on him from every direction. Jimmy, a voice called out, pulling him from his thoughts. He looked up and saw Mr. Santos standing on his front porch, a curious look on his face. Jimmy walked over, giving the old man a polite nod. "Morning, Mr. Santos," he said. Mr. Santos gave him a long, appraising look, his eyes narrowing slightly. "I saw that fancy car parked in front of your house yesterday," he said, his voice casual, though there was something in his tone that put Jimmy on edge. "What's going on, kid?" Jimmy shrugged, trying to keep his voice. "Even just someone thanking me for helping them out," he said, keeping the explanation simple. Mr. Santos raised an eyebrow, his gaze sharp. "And they offered you something, didn't they?" he asked. Jimmy hesitated, then nodded. "Yeah, they wanted to help us out, to thank me." He said, his voice uncertain. Mr. Santos let out a long sigh, shaking his head. You know, kid, nothing in this world comes for free. There's always a price. You help people like that, and you'll end up owing them more than you ever thought. He said, his voice, serious. Jimmy swallowed, feeling the weight of the words pressing on him. I know, Mr. Santos. I don't know what to do. The old man patted Jimmy's shoulder, his grip firm. Be careful, kid. I've seen too many people get taken in by promises. Don't be one of them. Jimmy nodded, his heart feeling heavy. Thanks, Mr. Santos. He said quietly, turning and walking away. The old man's words echoed in his mind as he walked, mixing with the whispers of the neighbors and the worry in his mom's voice. He knew he had to be careful, but part of him still couldn't shake the thought that maybe this was different. Maybe it really was just to thank you. When Jimmy got home, his mom was waiting for him. Her eyes filled with worry. Jimmy, we need to talk. She said, her voice firm. Jimmy looked at her, his stomach twisting. What's wrong? He asked, his voice hesitant. His mom glanced around, then lowered her voice. Some of the neighbors have been talking. They're saying that we shouldn't trust that man, that we should just walk away from this. She said, her voice trembling slightly. She looked at Jimmy, her eyes filled with fear. Jimmy, I don't want anything bad to happen to you. Maybe we should just forget about it. Jimmy looked down the card still in his pocket, feeling like it weighed a ton. He could feel the tension in the air, the worry in his mom's voice, the judgment in the neighbor whispers. He closed his eyes, taking a deep breath. Okay, Mom, he said. Finally, his voice quiet. Weck, let it go. I won't call him his mom. Let out a long breath, relief flooding her face. She pulled Jimmy into a tight hug, her arms wrapped around him protectively. Thank you, Jimmy, she whispered, her voice cracking. Thank you. Jimmy hugged her back, his chest tight. He knew it was the right decision, but it didn't make it any easier. He could still see George's face, the gratitude in his eyes. He could still hear Michael's voice, the sincerity in his words, but for now, he would let it go. He had to. The rest of the day was heavy, the decision weighing on him like a stone. Jimmy tried to go about his usual routine, running errands for neighbors, helping his mom around the house. But no matter what he did, he couldn't shake the feeling that maybe he had made a mistake. Maybe he was letting fear hold him back, letting the whispers of others decide his future. That evening, as he sat outside on the small stoop in front of their house, Jimmy saw George again. The old man was in his wheelchair, coming down the street. Slowly, Jimmy stood up, his heart pounding as he walked over to him. Hey, George, he called, his voice a little uncertain. George looked up, his face lighting up with a smile when he saw Jimmy. Hey there, kid. How are you holding up? Jimmy shrugged, his eyes dropping to the ground. I don't know. He admitted your son came by and he offered to help us, but I don't know if we can take it. George's smile softened and he nodded, wheeling himself a little closer. I figured he'd do something like that. He said, his voice gentle. Listen, Jimmy, I understand if you're scared, if you're worried, but I want you to know something. You saved my life. That's not a small thing, and what my son wants to do, it's just a way of saying thank you. Nothing more? Jimmy looked at George, the sincerity in his eyes almost overwhelming. But what if there's a catch? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. George shook his head. There's no catch, kid, just gratitude. Sometimes people really do just want to help. Jimmy nodded slowly, but the uncertainty still wet at him. I told my mom I wouldn't do it, he said, his voice quiet. George smiled, a sad but understanding smile. That's okay. Jimmy, you've got to do what you think is right. Just know that the offer is always there, no matter what. Jimmy nodded again, his heart feeling heavy. He watched as George wheeled himself away, the old man giving him a small wave before turning the corner. Jimmy stood there for a long time, the sun setting behind him, the shadows growing longer on the cracked pavement. When he finally went back inside, his mom was waiting for him. Her eyes filled with relief when she saw him. Jimmy gave her a small smile, though it didn't reach his eyes. Are you okay, Jimmy? She asked, her voice gentle. Jimmy nodded. Yeah, Mom, I'm okay, he said, though, deep down. He wasn't sure if that was true that night. As he lay on his mattress, staring up at the ceiling, Jimmy couldn't help but wonder if he was making the right choice. He could hear the whispers of the neighbors in his head, could feel the weight of his mom's fear pressing down on him. But he could also see George's face. Hear his words. The gratitude in his voice, Jimmy closed his eyes, taking a deep breath. He didn't know what the future held, but for now, he had made his decision. He would let it go. He would protect his family, even if it meant walking away from something that could have changed their lives. A week had passed since Jimmy told his mom he'd let go of the idea of taking help from George and Michael. The days felt slower, heavier somehow, and the tension seemed to stick to everything. His mother was visibly more relaxed, relieved by Jimmy's decision, but Jimmy himself was still weighed down by the lingering uncertainty on this. This particular morning, Jimmy woke up late. The sun was already high, and the light streaming through the window was almost blinding. He rubbed his eyes, sitting up and stretching his arms. He could hear his mom in the kitchen humming softly as she cooked. The sound was comforting, but something still felt off. Jimmy stepped out of his room, heading to the kitchen. His mom smiled when she saw him, her face looking softer than it had in days. "Good morning, Jimmy," she said, placing a plate in front of him. "I thought you were going to sleep the whole day away." Jimmy smiled faintly, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. "Morning, Mom, just tired." I guess he sat down, picking up a fork and playing with the food on his plate. His mother watched him for a moment, her expression turning serious. "Are you sure you're okay, Jimmy?" she asked, her voice soft. Jimmy nodded, forcing himself to smile. "Yeah, Mom, I'm fine." Before his mother could press any further, a sudden noise interrupted them. It was the unmistakable sound of a car engine, and not just any car. It was a luxury car, the kind that didn't belong in their neighborhood. Jimmy's heart skipped a beat, his fork clattering onto his plate. He looked at his mother, who had gone pale, her eyes wide with fear. "Jimmy, she started," but her voice trailed off as the sound of the car door opening echoed through the air. Jimmy stood up, his heart pounding in his chest, and walked to the door. He could feel his mother's eyes on him, her fear almost tangible. He pushed the door open and his stomach twisted at what he saw. It was Michael stepping out of the same shiny luxury car that had drawn so much attention before he looked up, meeting Jimmy's eyes and gave him a small smile. Jimmy swallowed. Stepping out onto the porch, his heart pounding, Michael called his voice, calm but serious. He walked over to the porch, stopping a few feet away from Jimmy. "I need to talk to you." Jimmy nodded slowly, glancing back at the house where his mother stood just inside the door, her face filled with worry. He turned back to Michael, his body tense. "What is it?" Jimmy asked, his voice coming out sharper than he intended. Michael hesitated for a moment, then took a step. "Closer?" "Listen, Jimmy. I know you're hesitant about this, and I understand why, but my father, he's been worried about you. He wants to help you, and so do I. We don't want anything from you in return. It's just gratitude, plain and simple." Jimmy clenched, his jaw, his eyes dropping to the ground. "I told you, I'm not sure if we can accept it," he muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. Michael let out a sigh, his shoulders sagging slightly. "I understand that, Jimmy, but my father and I talked, and we agreed that we can't just let this go. What you did for him it was something no one else would have done, and we want to make sure you and your family are taken care of." He reached into his pocket, pulling out an envelope. Jimmy's eyes widened. As Michael held it out to him, inside is some financial help. "Just a start to get you through the next few months, and my number, if you ever need anything, you call me." Michael said, his voice gentle but firm. Jimmy stared at the envelope, his stomach twisting. He glanced back at the door, meeting his mother's eyes. Her face was pale, her hands trembling slightly as she watched. I don't know," Jimmy said, shaking his head. Michael nodded, taking a step closer. "You don't have to decide now, Jimmy, but please at least take the envelope, think about it. I'm not asking you to make a decision right here, right now." Jimmy hesitated, his hand trembling as he reached out and took the envelope. He could feel the weight of it, the thickness of the paper, and he swallowed hard. "Thank you," he said quietly, not meeting Michael's eyes. Michael gave him a small smile, nodding. "You're welcome, Jimmy. Just think about it, all right? My father would really like to know that you're okay." He turned, walking back to the car. Jimmy watched as he got in the car, pulling away moments later, leaving Jimmy standing on the porch, the envelope heavy in his hands. He turned, walking back inside. His mother was standing just inside the door, her eyes wide as she looked at the envelope in his hands. "Jimmy, what is that?" she asked, her voice trembling. Jimmy looked down at the envelope, his stomach twisting. It's help?" "Mom, Michael wants to help us. He said we don't have to decide now. He just wanted me to take it and think about it." His mother's face crumpled, her eyes filling with tears. She shook her head, her hands trembling as she reached out and touched the envelope. "Jimmy, I don't know. I don't know if we can trust this," she whispered. Jimmy looked at her, his heart heavy. "I know, Mom. I don't know either, but maybe it's worth considering. Maybe it's not a trick. Maybe they just really want to help." His mother looked down, her shoulders sagging. She let out a long, shaky breath, her fingers brushing against the edge of the envelope. "I don't want you to get hurt, Jimmy," she said, her voice barely audible. "We've been through enough." Jimmy nodded, his eyes dropping to the floor. "I know, Mom. I don't want us to get hurt either, but maybe this could make things better. Maybe we don't have to struggle so much." His mother looked at him, her eyes filled with tears, and for a long moment there was only silence. Finally, she let out a shaky breath, nodding. "All right, Jimmy, we'll think about it, but we have to be careful. I don't want us to end up worse off than we are now." Jimmy nodded, the weight of her words settling heavily in his chest. He slipped the envelope into his pocket, his hands trembling slightly. "I understand, Mom. I promise I'll be careful." His mother gave him a sad smile, reaching out and pulling him into a hug. "I know you will, Jimmy. You've always been careful. Just don't let anyone take advantage of you." Jimmy hugged her back, his chest tight. He knew what she meant, knew the fear behind her words. He had seen firsthand what could happen when someone trusted too easily, when someone believed in promises that were too good to be true. He wasn't going to make the same mistake later that day. Jimmy walked to the place where everything had happened, where he had saved George G., where the dog had attacked. The street was empty, the sun casting long shadows across the pavement. Jimmy stood there staring at the spot where George's wheelchair had been, where the dog's snarls had echoed off the walls. He closed his eyes, taking a deep breath. The fear was still there, the uncertainty, but there was something else too, a sense of resolve, a feeling that what he had done mattered. He had helped someone, even though he had been scared, even though he could have walked away. He opened his eyes. Looking around the quiet street, he could feel the weight of the envelope in his pocket, the uncertainty of what lay ahead. But for now, he knew one thing he wasn't going to: let fear decide his future. He had already faced danger head on, and he could do it again. Jimmy turned, walking back towards home. He could hear the whispers of his neighbors, could feel their eyes on him, but he ignored them. He knew what they were saying, knew they thought he was making a mistake, but they didn't know Michael or George. They didn't know what had happened, what it felt like to look into someone's eyes and know you had saved them as he walked. Jimmy thought about his mother, about the look in her eyes when she saw the envelope. He knew. She was scared that she wanted to protect him, but maybe, just maybe, this was an opportunity to protect her too, to make things a little easier for their family, to take away some of the burden she carried every single day when he got home. His mother was sitting at the kitchen table, her hands folded together, her eyes filled with worry. Jimmy walked over, sitting down across from her. He reached into his pocket, pulling out the envelope and placing it on the table. "Mom," he said, his voice steady, "I've made up my mind. I think we should accept it, but only if we can find a way to do it that keeps us safe. I want to make sure you're okay, that we're all okay, and maybe this is the way to do that." His mother looked at the envelope, then back at him, her eyes filled with tears. She nodded slowly, her hand reaching out to touch the envelope. "All right, Jimmy," she whispered, "but we'll do it our way, carefully." Jimmy nodded, a sense of relief washing over him. He knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but he was ready to face it for his mother, for his sister, for himself. He had already faced his fears once, and he could do it again. The next morning, Jimmy woke up with a strange sense of purpose. The envelope was still on the kitchen table where he and his mom had left it. The night before, the decision had been made. They were going to accept Michael's help, but they would do it on their own terms. Jimmy felt a knot of both anxiety and hope. Sitting in his stomach, he knew it wouldn't be easy, but maybe it was the right move to make things better for his family. Jimmy got up quickly, washing his face and throwing on his usual clothes, a faded shirt and worn shorts. He could hear his mom in the kitchen. The soft sounds of plates and cups being moved around. He took a deep breath and walked into the room, finding his mom sitting at the table, the envelope in front of her, her eyes locked on it, mourning. "Mom," Jimmy said, his voice gentle. His mom looked up, her eyes filled with that same worry that had been there since Michael first showed up. She gave him a small smile, nodding, mourning. "Jimmy, are you sure you're ready for this?" she asked, her voice hesitant. Jimmy nodded, pulling a chair out and sitting across from her. "I think it's the right thing to do, Mom. If we do it our way carefully like we talked about, then maybe it will help us out," he said, his voice steady. His mom let out a long breath, her fingers tracing the edge of the envelope. "All right, Jimmy, let's do it." She picked up the envelope, opening it slowly. Inside, there was a stack of cash, crisp bills, folded neatly, and a piece of paper with Michael's phone number and a few lines written in careful handwriting. Jimmy watched as his mom unfolded the paper, her eyes scanning the words. "He's saying we can use the money. However, he wants to come by later today to talk about the rest," she said, her voice low. Jimmy nodded, his heart thawing in his chest. "We'll meet him then, but we'll be smart about it. We'll ask questions, make sure we understand everything before we accept anything else," he said, his eyes locking with his mother's. His mom smiled, though there was still a trace of sadness in her eyes. "You're growing up too fast, Jimmy," she said softly. "I just want you to be a kid, to not have to think about things like this." Jimmy reached across the table, taking his mom's hand in his. "I know, Mom, but I want to help you." This is the way to do that. The day felt like it dragged on forever as Jimmy waited for Michael to come by. He tried to keep himself busy, running errands, doing chores around the house, but his mind kept drifting back to what lay ahead. The knot in his stomach never really went away, growing tighter as the hours ticked by. Finally, in the late afternoon, the sound of a car pulling up outside made Jimmy freeze. He looked at his mom, who had been sitting on the couch, her hands resting on her lap. She looked at him, her eyes filled with uncertainty, and then nodded. "Let's go meet him," she said, her voice steady. Jimmy walked over to the door, opening it and stepping out onto the porch. The luxury car was parked in front of their house, and Michael stepped out, giving Jimmy and his mom a small smile as he approached. "Jimmy, Mrs. Harris," Michael said, nodding at each of them. "Thank you for agreeing to meet me." Jimmy's mom gave him a polite nod, her expression guarded. "We appreciate your father's offer, but we want to be clear about what this means," she said, her voice firm. Michael nodded, a serious look crossing his face. "Of course, I want you both to understand. This is a gesture of gratitude, nothing more. My father was deeply affected by what happened. He wants to help, not just to repay you, but to make sure you're okay. There's no catch, no strings attached. This is about making things right for the kindness Jimmy showed him." Jimmy watched Michael's face, trying to read his sincerity. His mom was quiet for a moment. Then she nodded slowly. "All right, but we want to make sure we do this in a way that doesn't put us at risk." She said, "We want to use this money to improve our situation, but we don't want to be dependent on anyone." Michael smiled, nodding. "I understand, and I think that's the right approach." He reached into his pocket, pulling out another piece of paper. "This is a written agreement. It states clearly that this money is a gift, not a loan. You don't owe us anything, now or in the future. It's just to help you get through these next few months, to make things a little easier." Jimmy's mom took the paper, her eyes scanning the words she looked at. Michael, her eyes, still cautious, and there's nothing else. No expectation of anything in return. Michael shook his head. "Nothing at all. My father just wants to help." Jimmy glanced at his mom, seeing the uncertainty in her eyes slowly begin to fade. She looked back at the paper, then at Michael. "All right, we accept. But we want you to know that we intend to use this to make things better for ourselves. We don't want to depend on anyone," she said firmly. Michael smiled, nodding. "I wouldn't expect anything less," held out his hand, and Jimmy's mom shook it, her expression softening. Jimmy felt the knot in his stomach loosen slightly, the tension beginning to drain from his body. He looked at Michael, who turned to him, a warm smile on his face. "Jimmy, I'm proud of you. You made a brave choice, both with my father and now accepting help for your family. It's not easy to do, That Michael said, his voice. Genuine Jimmy nodded, feeling a sense of relief wash over him. "Thank you," he said quietly. "I just want to make sure my mom and my sister are okay." Michael smiled, nodding again. "I think you're doing a great job of that. If you ever need anything, you have my number, and I mean anything." Jimmy nodded, tucking the number back into his pocket. "Thank you, Michael. I appreciate it." With that, Michael turned and walked back to his car. He gave them a final wave before getting in and driving away, leaving Jimmy and his mom standing on the porch. Jimmy let out a long breath, his shoulders sagging as the tension finally began to leave his body. His mom looked at him, her eyes filled with a mix of relief and pride. She reached out, placing a hand on his shoulder. "Jimmy, I know this isn't easy for you, but I want you to know that I'm proud of you. You're doing everything you can to help us, and that means more to me than anything," she said, her voice thick with emotion. Jimmy smiled, his eyes stinging slightly. "I just want to make things better, Mom, for you and for my sister." His mom nodded, her eyes shining with tears. "And you are Jimmy. You really are that night." The house felt different. There was a sense of hope that hadn't been there in a long time. A feeling that maybe things could really change. Jimmy lay on his mattress, staring up at the ceiling. The envelope was still on the kitchen table, but now it felt different. It wasn't just money. It was an opportunity, a chance to make things better for his family, to lift some of the weight that had been pressing down on them for so long. Jimmy closed his eyes, taking a deep breath. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but he felt ready to face it, for his mom, for his sister, for himself. He had already faced danger head-on, and he could do it again. And now, for the first time, he felt like maybe, just maybe, they were going to be okay. The next day began like any other, but the weight in the air had shifted. Jimmy awoke with a sense of determination he hadn't felt in a long time. He quickly got dressed and walked into the kitchen. His mother was already there, looking through the envelope they had gotten from Michael. She seemed lost in thought, her fingers carefully counting the bills. "Morning," Mom, Jimmy said, his voice cheerful. He wanted to set a different tone to help her believe that things could really get better. She looked up and smiled, though there was still a trace of uncertainty in her eyes. "Morning, Jimmy, I was just thinking about how we're going to use this," she said, her voice thoughtful. She placed the money back into the envelope and patted it gently. Jimmy nodded, sitting down across from her. "I was thinking, maybe we could start by getting you the treatment you need for your back. Mom, you've been in pain for so long," he said, his voice gentle. His mom looked at him, her eyes softening. "Oh, Jimmy, I don't know, there are so many other things we could do with this money. I don't want to spend it all on me," she said, her voice shaky. Jimmy reached out, taking her hand in his. "Mom, you're the most important person in this family. If you're not okay, nothing else can be. Let's take care of you first," he said firmly. His mother's eyes filled with tears, and she nodded slowly. "Okay, Jimmy, we'll do that. I'll call the clinic today and see what we can do," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Jimmy smiled, giving her hand a gentle squeeze. "Good, and I was thinking, maybe we could also use some of the money to get better supplies for your sewing. You could make more things to sell," he added, his voice brightening. His mom's eyes lit up at that, and she nodded. "That's a good idea. Jimmy, I could make more dresses, maybe even start selling to more people," she said, her voice hopeful. Jimmy grinned, feeling a warmth spread through his chest. "Exactly, we can start small, but I know you'll do great that day." Jimmy walked through the neighborhood with a new sense of purpose. So, the sun was shining and the air felt lighter, the tension of the past few weeks finally starting to ease. He walked down to the school, setting up with his box of candies as usual. But this time, there was something different. He wasn't just trying to scrape by. He was planning for something more. "Hey, Jimmy," Sam, one of the older boys, called out as he approached. He was already on his way to school, his backpack slung over one shoulder. "Hey, Sam," Jimmy called back, giving him a nod. Sam eyed him, curiously, a smile tugging at his lips. "You seem different today, man. What's up?" Jimmy shrugged, a grin spreading across his face. "Just got some good news. That's all," he said. Sam raised an eyebrow, his curiosity piqued. "Good news, huh? You're going to share?" Jimmy hesitated, aided for a moment, then shook his head and, "Not yet, but soon you'll see," he said, his voice filled with confidence. Sam laughed, giving Jimmy a playful punch on the shoulder. All right, man, keep your secrets. Just don't forget about us when you're famous or something. Jimmy grinned, shaking his head. Never, man. You know that the day passed quickly, and by the time Jimmy returned home, he found his mom on the phone, her face lit up with excitement. She gave Jimmy a thumbs up as he entered the house, her smile widening. Yes, thank you. So much will see you at the clinic tomorrow, she said before hanging up. She looked at Jimmy, her eyes shining. I got an appointment, Jimmy. They said they can see me tomorrow. Jimmy felt a surge of relief, a grin spreading across his face. That's great, Mom. See, things are already getting better. His mom nodded, her eyes misty. She walked over to Jimmy, pulling him into a tight hug. Thank you, Jimmy. I don't know what I'd do without you. She whispered, her voice thick with emotion. Jimmy hugged her back, his chest tight. You don't ever have to find out, Mom. I'm always here. The next morning, Jimmy and his mom made their way to the clinic. It was a small building, a few blocks away, and they walked there together. Their steps, slow and steady, Jimmy could see the worry in his mom's eyes, but there was also hope. And that was enough for him when they reached the clinic. They were greeted by a nurse who led them inside. Jimmy sat in the waiting room, his hands resting on his knees, his heart pounding. He wanted this to work. He wanted his mom to be okay. After what felt like forever, his mom finally emerged, a small smile on her face. She walked over to Jimmy, her eyes filled with relief. They said it's going to take some time, but they think they can help me. She said, her voice trembling slightly. Jimmy felt a rush of emotion, his eyes stinging. He stood up, pulling his mom into a hug. That's all that matters, Mom. We'll take it one day at a time, he said, his voice thick that evening. Jimmy's mom was in the kitchen, her sewing machine set up on the table. She was working on a new dress, her hands moving quickly. Her eyes focused, Jimmy watched her from the doorway, a smile on his face. She looked different, lighter, more hopeful. He walked over, sitting down next to her. What are you working on, Mom? He asked, his voice curious. She looked up, her eyes bright. Just a new design I thought of. I think it could sell well, she said, her voice filled with excitement. Jimmy grinned, nodding. I bet it will. You're amazing, Mom. His mom smiled, her eyes misty. And you're my biggest supporter, Jimmy. The next day, Jimmy decided to go and visit George. It had been a while since he last saw him, and he wanted to thank him for everything he had done. He made his way to George's house, his steps light the sun shining down on him. When he reached George's house, he found the old man sitting outside his wheelchair, parked under the shade of a tree. George looked up, his face breaking into a wide smile when he saw Jimmy. Well, look who it is, George called out, his voice filled with warmth. How are you, kid? Jimmy walked over, sitting down on the curb next to George. I'm good, George. Really good, he said, his voice sincere. George raised an eyebrow, his eyes filled with curiosity. Is that so? What's changed? Jimmy smiled, his heart swelling. Michael helped us out. We decided to accept it, and now things are starting to get better. My mom's getting treatment. She's sewing again. It's all thanks to you, George, he said, his voice thick with emotion. George reached out, placing a hand on Jimmy's shoulder. No, kid, it's thanks to you. You made all of this happen. You're the one who stepped up, who made a difference. Jimmy looked down, his cheeks turning red. I just wanted to help. George smiled, his eyes softening. And you did more than you know. They sat there in silence for a while, the breeze rustling the leaves above them. Jimmy felt a sense of peace wash over him, the kind he hadn't felt in a long time. For the first time, he felt like maybe things were really going to be okay. When Jimmy got home, his mom was still working on her dress, her sewing machine humming softly. His little sister was playing on the floor, her laughter filling the room. Jimmy watched them for a moment, his heart swelling with love for his family. He knew they still had a long way to go, but for now they were taking steps in the right direction. Jimmy walked over, sitting down next to his sister, picking up one of her toys. She looked up at him, her eyes wide, and then smiled, her small arms wrapping around his neck in a tight hug. Jimmy, she squealed, her laughter echoing through the small room. Jimmy hugged her back, a grin spreading across his face. Hey, kiddo, he said, his voice soft. He looked up at his mom, who was watching them, her eyes filled with love. Things are going to be different now, aren't they? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Jimmy nodded, his heart swelling. Yeah, Mom. They are. We're going to be okay. His mom smiled, her eyes misty. I believe you, Jimmy, that night. As Jimmy lay down on his mattress, staring up at the ceiling, he felt a sense of hope he hadn't felt in a long time. The cracks in the ceiling didn't seem so dark anymore. The weight on his chest had lifted, and for the first time he allowed himself to really dream about the future. Jimmy closed his eyes, a smile on his face. Things were going to be different. Now they were going to be better, and for that he was grateful. The sun was just beginning to rise. As Jimmy stepped out of his house the morning, air was cool against his skin, and the streets were still quiet. Only the sound of distant birds breaking the silence. Jimmy looked around, taking in the view of his neighborhood, the worn-out houses, the cracked pavement, the children's toys scattered across small yards. Everything looked the same, but something about it felt different. There was a new hope in the air, a hope that Jimmy hadn't felt for a long time. Jimmy took a deep breath. The sense of possibility swelling in his chest today was a new day, and he was ready for whatever it would bring. He started his walk, his bare feet kicking up small puffs of dust as he moved down the street. The sun was climbing higher now, warming his skin. As he made his way to the school to set up his candy box just like every other day. But even though the routine was the same, Jimmy felt lighter. He knew things were changing when he reached the school. He set up his box near the gate, his eyes scanning the familiar faces of children and parents as they passed by some. Some of them gave him curious glances. Others waved, and a few of the kids came running up, their eyes wide with excitement. Hey, Jimmy, got anything new today? One of the younger boys asked, his face lighting up as he looked at the candies. Jimmy smiled, nodding. Sure, got a fresh batch. This morning, he said, opening the box and showing the colorful wrappers. The kids picked out their favorites, their hands darting into the box, their laughter filling the air. Jimmy watched them, his smile widening. He had always liked doing this, bringing a little bit of joy to the kids around him, even if it was just with a piece of candy after a while. The crowd began to thin. As the kids went inside for their classes, Jimmy packed up his box, slipping the snap. The small coins into his pocket, he turned about to head back home when he heard a voice call out Jimmy. He turned, seeing George come down the street in his wheelchair. His son, Michael, walking beside him. Jimmy's face lit up, and he walked over to meet them. Hey, George, Michael, Jimmy said, giving them both a nod. George smiled, his eyes crinkling at the corners. Hey there, kid. Thought we'd come by and see how you were doing. Michael nodded, giving Jimmy a warm smile. My dad's been wanting to come by and see you again. We've been hearing good things, he said, his voice full of warmth. Jimmy smiled, glancing down at the ground for a moment before looking back at them. Things are getting better, he said quietly. My mom's getting treatment and she's sewing again. It's all because of you guys. George shook his head, his expression serious. No, Jimmy, it's because of you. You were the one who stepped up, who took the risk. We just gave a little push, the rest. You did that. Jimmy felt his face grow warm, and he looked away, feeling a sense of pride swell in his chest. Thanks, George, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Michael smiled, nodding. We're proud of you, Jimmy. My dad and I both are. You're doing something amazing. Here, Jimmy nodded, his eyes misting. I just want to make sure my family's okay. That's all that matters to me. George nodded, his eyes filled with understanding. And you're doing that, Jimmy, better than anyone else could. Jimmy looked at them, his heart swelling with gratitude. He reached out, shaking Michael's hand, then leaning down to give George a hug. Thank you, he said, his voice thick with emotion for everything. George patted his back, his voice gentle. You take care of yourself, kid. And remember, if you ever need anything, we're here. Jimmy nodded, stepping back and giving them a final wave before turning to head back home. The sun was shining brightly now, warming the pavement beneath his feet, and Jimmy felt a sense of hope that he hadn't felt in a long time. As he walked back through the neighborhood, he could see his mom standing outside their house, her sewing machine set up on the small table she had dragged outside. She was working on a dress, her hands moving quickly. Her face focused, Jimmy smiled. As he approached the sight, filling him with a sense of pride. Hey, Mom, he called, walking over and sitting down next to her. His mom looked up, her face lighting up with a smile. "Hey, Jimmy, how was your morning?" She asked, her voice bright. Jimmy shrugged, his smile widening. "It was good. Ran into George and Michael again. They just wanted to see how we were doing." His mom's eyes softened and she nodded. "They're good people. Jimmy, we're lucky to have them in our lives." Jimmy nodded, his eyes dropping to the sewing machine, watching as his mom worked. "You're getting pretty good at that," he said, his voice filled with admiration. His mom chuckled, shaking her head. "Still got a lot to learn, but it feels good to be doing something again," she said, her voice sincere. Jimmy looked at her, his heart swelling with love for his mother. He reached out, giving her hand a gentle squeeze. "You're doing great, Mom. I'm really proud of you." His mom smiled, her eyes misty. "And I'm proud of you, Jimmy. You've made all of this possible." Later that afternoon, Jimmy's little sister came running out of the house, her small feet pounding against the pavement. She ran straight to Jimmy, her arms wrapping around his neck as she hugged him tightly. "Jimmy," she squealed, her laughter filling the air. Jimmy hugged her back, lifting her off the ground and spinning her around. "Hey, kiddo," he said, his own laughter mixing with hers. His mom looked over at them, her eyes filled with love. "Careful, Jimmy," she called, her voice teasing. Jimmy set his sister back down, ruffling her hair gently. All right, we'll be careful," he said, winking at his mom. The afternoon passed in a blur of laughter and warmth. Jimmy spent time playing with his sister, helping his mom with her sewing, and just enjoying the peace that had settled over their home. It was a feeling that was so rare, so precious, and Jimmy wanted to hold on to it for as long as he could. As the sun began to set, Jimmy sat on the small stoop in front of their house, his sister curled up next to him, her head resting on his shoulder. The sky was a brilliant orange, the sun casting long shadows across the neighborhood. Jimmy watched as the lights in the houses around them flickered on one by one, filling the street with a warm glow. His mom came out, sitting down on the other side of him, her eyes on the horizon. She let out a long, contented sigh, her hand resting on Jimmy's knee. "It's been a long time since I felt this way," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Jimmy turned to her, his eyes filled with curiosity. "What do you mean, Mom?" His mom smiled, her eyes misty, like things might actually be okay. "Like we're gonna make it," Jimmy nodded, his heart swelling. "We are, Mom. I promise you we're gonna be okay." His mom looked at him, her eyes filled with love. She leaned over, kissing his forehead gently. "I believe you, Jimmy. I really do." That night, as Jimmy lay down on his mattress, the familiar cracks in the ceiling seemed softer. Somehow the house was quiet. The only sound was the gentle breathing of his little sister as she slept nearby. Jimmy closed his eyes, a sense of peace washing over him. He knew they still had a long road ahead, that there would be more challenges, more obstacles, but for the first time he felt ready, he felt strong, he felt hopeful. Jimmy took a deep breath, a smile pulling at his lips. He had faced fear, he had faced danger, and he had come out stronger. He had protected his family, he had made things better, and for that he was proud. He knew that things were never going to be perfect, that there would always be struggles, but he also knew that he had the courage to face whatever came next. And for now, that was enough. The sun would rise again, and Jimmy would be ready to meet it. He would walk forward one step at a time with his family by his side, and the hope that things would get better one day at a time, and that he thought, as he drifted off to sleep, was all he needed.